Paleo to Pioneer presents Small Batch Science, Episode 8.
Hi, and welcome back to Small Batch Science. Today we're going to continue to talk about the organic bone, antler, ivory, teeth tools from early Paleoindian sites across North America predominantly. I may mention a couple other things. I went way too long the last time and still left out some spectacular things that at least are published either in the Dunbar and Webb chapter from '96 or in the Clovis Technology book. Once again, that makes it in. I want to show this. We have no idea what it is. I call it the giant Pleistocene hockey puck. It's a disc of cortical bone, clearly not natural, that was found at the Butler site, which is the confluence of the Santa Fe and Itchtucknee rivers in North Florida. It is my candidate for, bar none really, the most important Paleoindian site in North America you never heard of. 3 collectors from the 60s sat down one time prior to 1980 or about 1980 and decided that between the 3 of them they'd found 475 lancelet points there, mostly like swanies and such, but something really important going on there that we just don't know, and there's a few things from that site that just defy description. Is that 3/4 of a moon? Is it broken? Were they playing air hockey? We have no idea, and it's at least mentioned if not shown in the Clovis Technology book. These are some favorites. These are 2 of the 5 of them that came out of the oscilla. I think I mentioned these before. These are metatarsal daggers, quote unquote, for lack of a better term, from Pleistocene horses. I mention them again in passing because I want to move on to the fact that there's other direct evidence of horse interactions with humans. This is a green bone tibia that Dunbar and Webb talked about around the broken midsection, the diaphyses, the middle of the long part of the bone. 33 lapped flakes. Somebody went along and broke this 33 times, and I really don't think there's a good, rational, natural explanation for that. And finally, I think this is out of the Itchtucknee from Alvin Hendricks' collection. One of my favorites, it is a deer metacarpal, one of these guys, got the wrong end of course, that I think has been made into one of the earliest musical instruments in the New World. I suspect that the manufacturer and where it was found mean that it's Pleistocene, or could be Pleistocene, if maybe only early archaic Bolin, which would still put it in the 10 to 11,000 year old range. But that's an awful early flute, and I think that's what that is. You're seeing a couple of holes drilled. It's broken across one of the holes, and the grinding at this end to remove the articular surface is important, and we'll come to that in just a second. Because what I want to shift to now is that's the big neat stuff, and there's more of those out there. And if you have anything you want identified, let me know, because I'm happy to talk to you and tell you what I can about such things. But distinguishing natural unmodified bones and wood and other objects, and I'm not talking about stone at all today because it's just a whole ball of wax on its own, and we're not going we'll do it, but just not right now. But distinguishing natural, unaltered, and modified through other various means, whether it's critters in the wild, natural breakage and deterioration, or human agency, is obviously critical as archaeologists trying to figure these things out. Are they tools or not? Obviously, really spectacular examples are human-made, and there is no question about it. But when you start getting into how much work has been done on the tip of an antler pressure flaker or not, is that part of the normal wear and tear of a buck poking around and going through life and rubbing the velvet off and fighting and whatnot, or is it something else? And we don't do a very good job of teaching people how to look for these things and how to distinguish natural alternative processes from human work. And so I'll show you a couple of my favorites that I always love to use. Nature creates very strange things. Just a twig that has a perfect, lovely little arch in it. It can be very handy to make something out of. This obviously kind of spindly, but the idea is that naturally occurring things are selected by people to make things all the time. So a fortuitous shape doesn't necessarily mean it was made by a human, but it may get used by a human, and then it becomes a problem. Is it modified or not, and can we distinguish that? Another favorite, my smiley face from our opening picture, If you see the ends, they look pretty cleanly cut. By a beaver. There's a piece of beaver gnawed willow that obviously doesn't, it's not human, but it has all the bark removed. It looks like a handle, it looks like it's a something, and it's not, it's natural. Rodents, of course, are the bane of all existence of archaeology. I think this is a cow tibia. You can see some massive, I think that's a rat that did this, and it's chewed all over the place. I have dog gnawed stuff. I have mountain lion gnawed stuff that we've gotten very close by. This is bone, but here's rodent gnawed shell. It's probably a mouse that was chewing on that. This is the cap from a Grolsch bottle that somebody went to town on. All of that. It's a human artifact, but it's been modified by an animal that just chewed and chewed and chewed. Another good example of interesting things, I should have gotten one of these out. Walnuts that are
Two.
Sorry about that. This is hickory nut, hickory nut. I forget who it is. Anyway, this was at Wakala. They were falling out of the trees because the squirrels, and this is a flying squirrel that gnawed the hole in there, and they are actually different than the other kinds of squirrels. You can tell them apart, but again, looking at gnawing and determining that it's something other than humans digging holes in these or cracking them open is obviously critical. This is a real favorite because I found it out in our field with our cows. A big chunk of plastic that's been through a cow. This was in a cow pie. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it is. It's a human plastic something that a cow made into this. This is some of the twine that comes around the big round hay bales. This is a quid. Humans made quids. We chew yucca fibers out west in the southwest, make a little wad, almost like a chewing tobacco thing, and spit them up. But it's basically, in this case, something that's been to the stomach of a cow, spit back up and chewed, and they didn't like it, and spit it out. It's, again, a human artifact made into something else by an animal. I'll end this portion of the show and tell with my absolute favorite. If you know what this is, don't tell. Clearly, it's a piece of wood that's been modified. And you notice that it should be square. It started out like square all the way around. But you see this? How it's now rounded and worn. There's a real interesting pattern to it. It's very clearly been modified from the original shape that it was intended. This is the front door to a beehive. Bees did that. And I'll mention a couple of other things, and particularly because we're concerned with Pleistocene animals, you got to look out for the gnawing of other critters. Porcupines gnaw bone, and of all things, camelids will gnaw bone. So you can have camels, and I don't know if the llama, or if we think paleo llama or Hemiakinia did gnaw, but because the extant species, the ones that are around with us today, did gnaw bone, we've really got to pay attention to that. And make sure that we eliminate that as a possibility for things that are, if it's a iffy tool, or if it's a piece of some debitage broken on the way to making something else, being able to distinguish natural and human intention is a real problem. So, that said, when there's real human intention, it should be really obvious. So in episode 1 we talked about the bottom half of deer radii, or the radius of a deer, being made into a barbed bone fishhook, and that some of them had the whole articular end ground off. They'd get rid of all the bony protuberances, all the spiky bits on the bottom, and leave it pretty round. Well, so if you want to do that, and you want to show that this is an artifact, or that you want to tell that, say you've got one where they just started making a hook. There, that's it. What was that, 10 seconds? Now I realize they probably don't have slabs of concrete, but pieces of sandstone. Sometimes I found one naturally with a piece of a nice groove in it. They all work fine. I just do this for the dramatic effect of doing that in 5 seconds. So I'm going to do two things here. I'm going to sacrifice a couple pieces of bone. This is a pretty fresh deer metatarsal that still has one of the little knee joint bones attached through some grody sinew and stuff. Fits with Halloween. So this is a little yuck for a moment, but watch how quickly this bone comes off, and I'll take the end off of this. Seconds. I'll switch to a smaller metatarsal that has, it does have a fused end on it. I kept picking them up that were not. Notice I went back and forth before, now I'm going in a circular motion. And again, notice how quickly I've taken that off. Just a few seconds, and I messed it up because I'm rushing it to do this for the show here. But if we were to look at these under the microscope, you can tell in a heartbeat, no question, that these are human. This does not occur naturally. There is no chance. The striations on this, you can I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but they're swirled, they're crossed, they go back and forth in all manner of directions. If you know what you're looking at and you've done enough of these, you can tell at a glance. I was going in a circle. In this one, they go back and forth like this. You can actually start pretty quickly to see not just that it's human modified, but you can actually tell what the person was doing. And so looking at these things under the scope and handling them and understanding green bone versus which is flexible and pliable versus brittle dried out bone becomes really critical. And so I'll show a couple quick examples of other things. If you're at a historic site, it becomes obviously a bigger issue than for us worrying about things in the Pleistocene, but these are both saw cut. Actually, this is saw cut, this is cut with a Dremel, which is a rotary tool. And every now and then, if you mess up with your rotary tool, you'll leave a little spur of bone like that. Do you see where there's a groove cut? Well, the nature of that cut, whether it's with, you know, the edge of a metal knife or a rotary tool, so the metal knife is a pretty steep V. The rotary tool does this. You actually get squared off at the bottom. I can't quite make it square enough out, it's my hands, but as it's spinning, it gets a little messy sometimes because they are round and dust is accumulating there, but the nature of these cuts under 10 times magnification is really clear. You can tell at a heartbeat how they're doing it. And that's, of course, where you get into looking at cuts that are made by stone tools, are readily distinguishable from modern metal or rotary tools, whether it's a dental thing or a Dremel or whatever. It makes it really easy to see the different ways these things are being manufactured, and that's really, you know, where we want to get into what kinds of stone tools, whether it's grinding or cutting or a combination of both, and which is probably the most common. I talked about in the last one about the tusk out at Blackwater Draw that was girdled and then snapped off, and I found a piece of wood that shows that pretty well. This is a part of a Atlatl I was working on from some kind of oak. It's black oak. Anyway, an interesting kind of oak here in Florida, and you can see that basically a, you know, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch cube here, and worked it down about halfway with stone tools, and then got it close enough that I could just snap it off without, you know, breaking the end off the piece I wanted to keep. But a good example of that pecked, in this case just, you know, cut, pecked with stone. But that pecking around and then snapping it off is a really common manufacture technique, and we've seen that big piece out at Blackwater Draw, and out of the Ichtuckney was a piece, the tip of a tusk, where they basically got rid of that tip end that's curved more than the piece right behind it. They got rid of the piece they didn't want, and there's a thing that looks like those ice cream treats, the drumstick with the chocolate and the nuts and all that. It's a piece that looks like one of those that's slightly curved, but it's the other end of the piece that where it was cut off from the front end of the tusk at Blackwater Draw, and it's a good example of that. So we're going to take a minute and reset and show a bunch of experimental things and talk about how do we work from using known things that are obviously human artifacts, making them and breaking them, and what that can tell us about the whole of how they're used and how they're part of the culture of these early Paleo-Americans. Okay, so I'm going to skip around a little bit between learning things in terms of manufacture and then try and sort of do it in order from manufacture to hafting and use and breaking them intentionally and end up with that as a way to figure out how pieces that show up in the archaeological record are created or were created prehistorically. But I'm going to go ahead and start this part with the giant elephant in the room from down at Vero. This is a plastic cast of the drawing of the Mastodon, presumably Mastodon. The tusks don't seem to be curved like a mammoth, so we'll call it Mastodon for lack of a better term. That's not a particularly good example. I have a plaster cast that got dropped, but it still shows it pretty good. So the question is it real? Well, my answer to that is, I don't know. There's some things I really don't like. I don't like that the thing supposedly was found on the site and then supposedly was found 4 miles away, and I don't have a good resolution for that. Obviously they can't simultaneously both be true things, but we won't dwell on that. My concern is it's not like anything else, and I get that's a little thing, but we're talking about people and their patterned human behavior, and this doesn't fit any pattern that I'm aware of, and as you've probably noticed now, 45 minutes into the second video of these things, I try to pay pretty good attention to these things. That said, that's not a deal breaker, it's just something I bring up as a point to scratch your head about and say, well, there's another thing we don't know. I've handled the real one for about 15 minutes, got to look at it quite a bit. I kind of like it. I want to like it. But to my satisfaction as a scientist, there are certain questions that have not been addressed and have not been answered. And in my view, the articles that have been published thus far do not directly address the issues that I have with this piece. First off, and it's why I brought it up previously, is the notion of Dremel cuts. These are Dremel cuts into a piece of wood. I was at a conference where I had this sitting out on display, and another archaeologist scanned it at very high resolution and is absolutely convinced that the cuts are not, and has demonstrated they're not V-shaped like you would get with a stone flake. And this is a big clunky one. You can make much finer things like this little guy. The edge on that is, you know, we're down to sub-millimeter microns of width, and so the V would be very sharp and steep. He says you have a rotary tool, probably not a Dremel, but probably more like a dental thing. So if that's the case, then obviously we rule out it being made in the Pleistocene. But that's a simple thing. That should be addressed, and it could be discerned. We could rule it out, or say, we could figure it out one way or the other, and that just hasn't happened. And so to my satisfaction, the answer has to be, we don't know, maybe, but we could find out. And to me, that's what drives me crazy about it not being available for science at the moment, and for the last several years, is we could find out. And that hasn't yet happened. So let's concentrate on real archaeological things that aren't so equivocal. So here's my stand-in for an Atlatl dart and a nice approximation of an Atlatl with a antler hook. It's a replica of this one. This is the cast from Sloth Hole. That's antler, probably in excess. It's no newer than Bolin, so it's at least 11, maybe 12,000 years old. And honestly, I think it's probably Clovis, probably pushing into the 13,000-year-old range. We certainly have other examples, a couple of which I described in video 7. In this weapon system, what we typically find is the point. If we're lucky, we'll find, here's one of the small ones from Sheridan Cave in Ohio, that we'll find a bone or antler point as well. There's more of these than the other end of the Atlatl. And in Atlatls, I don't think until about 9,000 years ago, some nice Alaska examples and a few others from other places in dry caves out west and whatnot, it's 7,000 to 8,000 years before we start finding, maybe even younger than that, before we start finding complete Atlatls on the East Coast. All we get, if we're really lucky, is a hook from the end of the Atlatl, and it's basically conjecture from there forward, but it's our sort of best informed view of again, maximizing performance, making something that's really effective. None of these loops down the middle. Not if you want to stab a Mastodon. So, what's really interesting about this is experimentally using this for a decade now, this piece of antler is actually broken. While glued down to the piece of wood, then wrapped in sinew. Actually, the sinew is off of this one right now. That's just glue, but I've had it wrapped in sinew or artificial sinew and then glued again. It broke in use right down the middle, so I've been working on making a couple of new ones, but I've never heard anyone talk about generating that much force with an atlatl to break the hook while the hook remained hafted. That means it flexed so much that it actually snapped a piece of antler that you couldn't possibly do by hand. I couldn't, and I'm not necessarily the greatest example for people for that, but I'm pretty strong and you can't come close to it. It's just not something you're going to do by hand. It's through the use of that levered force, and it's a little insight, but it's a kind of interesting one, and it sets us up for where I want to end with this today. So, talk about a couple of manufacturing things. So this is again that Sheridan Cave one. Here's a mid-sized bone tool that's most similar to some pieces from Florida. One of the Anzig bone points that's been poorly reconstructed. One thing I wanted to mention real quick is that we don't think about this in archaeology, but I've started looking, and there are examples, I want to say from Paleolithic Europe, that to burnish these, once you've got the point shaped and your tools made how you want it, you want to basically crush all the micropores in the bone and make it, and give it a glassy surface, which is absolutely what we see. Like if you notice how shiny all those ivory tools were in the previous video, and of course I put them all away so we can't see them right now, it makes it so that that point becomes incredibly resilient, and I'll show you an example at the end that's really something spectacular of how resilient that is. But what you may or may not be able to see on the camera, if it picks it up, I'll try and rotate it a little bit. But now there's bone residue here. There's actually bone polish on the middle of this artifact. I've also done it on my hammerstone, my little hammerstone, that on again a very solid smooth rock. You can burnish the heck out of these things. It gives a very almost glass-like appearance at the end of this thing. It's just polished or literally burnished to a nice glossy sheen, but it also leaves those markings on the stone tools, and looking out for that is a real kind of interesting thing. I don't know if they're showing up real well on a cloudy day like this, but something we don't really think about as utilizing these for ulterior purposes. We'll skip a bit, and I bet we're going to get rained on, so we'll hustle up here. Making little bone beads and needles, eyed needles, is something, of course, from other examples that we showed earlier. You know, Pleistocene people were doing this. Certainly people in the Upper Paleolithic were doing these things for the better part of 40,000 years. There's some insights that come along from trying to manufacture or just selectively picking up flakes or shattered flake fragments that can be used to drill little holes is really important. I cheated. These are on the bone bead for preforms. Those were done with a little tiny Dremel attachment. But the trick is, and clearly people were doing this prehistorically, drill the hole first and then shape the needle around it. Here's an unfinished example. But because if you try and drill through your finished little bead that just needs a hole, it's impossible to hold it. You're going to stab yourself, you're going to scrape yourself. It just can't be done effectively. And it's one of those tools of the trade, or tricks of the trade, that if you drill the hole first and then shape the piece around it, worlds easier, and it avoids manufacturing failure as well, which is obviously an important thing when you want functioning tools. I have a couple of other examples out. One of the real common tools across North America in the Holocene, and we presumably think some of these are Pleistocene examples, is the deer ulna, that when it's complete looks like one of these. And here's one that's just sharpened to yield Pleistocene letter opener, I believe. Who knows? It's basically an awl with a nice handle on it, and you can use it for all manner of things. Little canoes, not really, that's just what you call them for lack of a better term. Deer teeth in the mandible, comb, pick, any number of other kind of scratching tool kind of things. Just showing an example of the cast of the presumable giant canid, maybe small direwolf, and awful big dog jaw that I made a decent replica of that. I don't know that I learned anything out of that I didn't already know from looking at the real one, but there, you know, that's why you do it. You try and figure these things out. This is one of my favorites, a handle. I think my columns made the handle, and then you'll notice there is the piece of stone broken off right in the middle of that. Well, this is one of those nice examples where Galt really showed us something interesting about a blade tool that had been used quite a bit. That it was actually notched at this, and we know that, I don't know how big the handle was, but I know it was this wide. The reason being, that was the space between the notches on a blade that had been worked into an end scraper. This isn't the same kind of thing, but it was along those lines. And when it snapped, the U-square shows you exactly how wide the handle was. We don't, it's the only part we get, but it's one of those things where by observing enough about it and the wear on the broken tool, you can figure some of these kinds of things out. Well, so one of my favorites, and I've put a lot of effort into this, and this back in the day was with a lot of help from my friend Micah, who helped make and use and destroy a lot of these things, and I'll show you my favorite one. For some reason at Sloth Hole, I have 22 of these. And we finally made one, and those are out of deer bone, but I've seen a couple in the bigger Pleistocene bone tool fragments. I just use this one again for size, but it's basically a point that was a little bit bigger than the complete one from Sheridan Cave here. What you're looking at is a double hinge fracture, and the bone tools that I used, the bone is getting a little brittle, so it's not behaving as nicely as the Pleistocene examples, but it's close. I got 22 of these things at Sloth Hole. What on earth are they doing? Well, it turns out they're probably spearing fish is my guess, but I don't know. That particular double hinge fracture, though, is created by using Atlatls and launching the heck out of your bone pointed darts. So, some halves broken when we were intentionally throwing them at trees or at pieces of plywood. Basically, we got to where we'd made them all, carved them up, made them in as authentic a fashion as we could, and picking up whatever we can for information along the way, and then discovered there's a real pattern to the breakage for some reason. Now they don't want to come apart. Humidity changed. That they keep breaking in 3 parts. This one's missing some of the tip, this one's missing the tip. The real challenge is, of course, when you launch a dart 30, 40, 50 feet into something and it snaps, they actually fold on themselves. The force makes them, it'll go fold this way and this way. And that's basically what's happening to create these little guys. And this is really the piece de resistance, and we are going to get pounded here in a minute, so we better go. Using an atlatl, launched a bone point that went completely through a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, stuck in our backstop, and actually the tip was poking out the second piece. That is a full 1.5 inches of plywood that it went through before it broke and created that particular snap, and the very tip of it is undamaged. Destroyed the point, but those bone points will quite literally go through anything, and that's in part why Clovis people were making and using short, straight, launched bone points and the stone ones. Bigger wound canal, but they fail, and they're not quite the needle that will go through anything, and that's really kind of one of the interesting aspects of this. So better quit there, and I've gone long enough again. Thank you for watching. Tune in. We'll put up a real fun one for Halloween in a couple days, and we'll see you later. Thanks.